In 1979, workers widening a highway in western Maryland cut into the earth and found bones. They were not old in the way archaeologists usually mean. These were not ancient. They belonged to people who had lived and died at a place called Catoctin Furnace, an iron forge built in the 1770s that burned for nearly 80 years. The workers had stumbled into a cemetery, one nobody alive remembered existed. Roughly 30 bodies were pulled from the ground, sent to the Smithsonian, catalogued, measured, and placed in storage. No one knew their names. These were Black Americans, enslaved and free, who had spent their lives feeding a furnace that forged iron for a young nation. Stoves, pots, cannonballs for the revolution. They worked in heat so intense it cracked stone. They hauled ore from the mountainside and kept fires burning through the night. The iron they made helped build a country that did not consider them citizens. And when they died, they were buried without headstones, without inscriptions, without anything that would tell the future who they had been. Just bodies in the ground beneath a road that was being widened so cars could move a little faster. For decades, nobody came looking for them. Nobody could. Because the thing about these 27 people, the thing that made their graves a perfect metaphor for something much larger, was that they existed in the same silence that had swallowed an entire people's past. That silence was not an accident. It was the design. For most of American history, Black families searching for their ancestors have hit the same wall. Genealogists call it the 1870 brick wall. In that year, 1870, the United States Census recorded Black Americans by name for the first time. Before that, enslaved people appeared in official records only as numbers: age, sex, dollar value. A 14-year-old girl might show up as a single line on a ledger, listed between a horse and a bale of cotton. Her name, wherever she came from, whatever language her grandmother spoke, none of that was written down. Not because no one cared to ask, because the system was designed so that no one would ask. 4 million people, and the paper trail treated every one of them like inventory. Think about what that means for someone alive today, trying to trace their family. If you are white in America, you can often follow your surname back through census records, ship manifests, church registers, sometimes all the way to a village in Ireland or a town in Bavaria. You can point to a place on a map and say, "That is where we came from." If you are Black in America, the trail goes cold around 1870. Before that year, the people you descend from were legally invisible. Their births were not always recorded. Their marriages were not recognized by law. Their deaths, when they were noted at all, were entered into the financial records of the people who owned them. That is not a gap in the record. That is the record working as intended. Slavery did not just steal labor. It did not just steal freedom. It stole knowledge. It stole the answer to the most basic human question a person can ask: where do I come from? And for 150 years, that theft seemed permanent. The wall held. The silence endured. The answer, for tens of millions of people, appeared to be gone. Then something changed. What happened over the last 2 decades is something no one in 1870 could have imagined. Scientists discovered that every human being carries inside their cells an unbroken chain of information passed down from every ancestor who ever lived. It cannot be burned in a courthouse fire. It cannot be sold at auction. It cannot be renamed on a bill of sale or separated from a mother at a slave market. It is there, in the blood and bone, whether anyone writes it down or not. And it waits. It waits for however long it takes for someone to learn how to read it. That moment came, and when it did not whisper. It roared. The first crack appeared in 2015. On the Caribbean island of St. Martin, construction workers had uncovered 3 skeletons buried in what had once been a Dutch colonial settlement. The bones dated to the 1600s, the earliest decades of the slave trade in the Americas. No documents survived for these individuals. No ship's log recorded their arrival. Even the name of the vessel that carried them was unknown, just a blank line in a database that tracked 35,000 voyages. But the bones still held DNA. A team of researchers extracted it, sequenced it, and ran it against genetic profiles from across the African continent. What came back was the first time anyone had traced an enslaved African's origins directly through their genome. One of the three individuals descended from Bantu-speaking peoples in what is now northern Cameroon. The other two carried genetic signatures linking them to non-Bantu populations in present-day Nigeria and Ghana. Three people, buried 4 centuries ago on a tiny Caribbean island, and science could now say with reasonable confidence where in Africa they had been taken from. 3 people, out of 12 million. It was a beginning, and it proved that the bodies held what the paper did not. 5 years later, the scale changed completely. In 2020, a team of geneticists published what became one of the most comprehensive investigations of the transatlantic slave trade ever conducted. They assembled DNA data from more than 50,000 people on both sides of the Atlantic, 30,000 of them of African descent, living across North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. Then they did something no one had attempted at this scale. They laid that genetic data alongside the actual shipping records of the slave trade. More than 35,000 documented voyages. 12 million people moved across an ocean over 3.5 centuries. A database of horror, compiled from captains' logs and port records and insurance documents that listed human beings as cargo. The question was deceptively simple. Does the DNA match what the ships say? In broad strokes, yes. The genetic connections between people living in the Americas today and populations along Africa's Atlantic coast mirrored the routes those ships had traveled. The corridors of forced migration that had reshaped the world between 1500 and 1866, those corridors were still visible in the code. West Africa, Central Africa, Senegambia, the Congo. The bodies of the living remembered what the ink on the manifests had recorded. That alone would have been remarkable. But the team looked closer, and the story shifted in ways nobody expected. The shipping records said that relatively few enslaved Africans were transported directly from the coast of what is now Nigeria to the ports of North America. The ships carrying captives from Nigerian regions, carrying Yoruba and Igbo and Isan people, went primarily to the Caribbean and to Brazil. The numbers were clear. The manifests were specific. But the DNA told a different story. Nigerian ancestry, specifically connections to the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Isan, was dramatically overrepresented in Black Americans. Far more than the shipping logs predicted. Far more than any model of direct transport could explain. One of the researchers said they could not believe the amount of Nigerian ancestry they were seeing in the United States. The explanation, once they found it, opened a chapter of history that had been hiding in plain sight. After European nations began banning the transatlantic slave trade in the early 1800s, the commerce did not stop. It moved sideways. It moved underground. Enslaved people who had been shipped from Nigeria to the British Caribbean were then quietly resold and transported to the American South to sustain an economy that could not function without forced labor. A second forced migration, one that never appeared on a transatlantic manifest because it never crossed the Atlantic. It happened between islands and coastlines, between ports in the Caribbean and harbors in the Gulf, documented poorly or not at all. The paper trail had been erased on purpose, but the DNA carried the receipt. I think about the Igbo woman whose great-grandmother was taken to Jamaica, whose grandmother was sold again to Georgia, whose mother was born on a cotton plantation, and whose descendants now live in Detroit. The shipping record says she came from the Caribbean. The DNA says she came from Nigeria. Both are true. but only one tells the whole story. And then there was the other side of the equation, the people who were missing. Senegambia, the region spanning modern-day Senegal and the Gambia, was one of the heaviest embarkation zones in the entire slave trade. Historical records indicate that roughly a quarter of all African ancestors of Black Americans were shipped from those coasts. The Wolof, the Mandinka, the Fulani. These peoples were among the first Africans brought to the Americas in significant numbers. Their presence in the genetic record should have been enormous. It was not. Senegambian ancestry was dramatically underrepresented. And the reason why is one of the hardest things in this entire story. Many Senegambians were rice cultivators in Africa. Because of that skill, that specific agricultural knowledge, they were deliberately targeted and sent to rice plantations along the coasts of South Carolina and Georgia. Those plantations sat on tidal marshland, surrounded by standing water, choked with mosquitoes. They were some of the most malarial environments in the entire American South. The death rates were catastrophic. Workers died faster than they could be replaced. Children died before they could grow. An entire people's genetic signal was diminished, not because they were never brought here, but because so many did not survive long enough to have descendants. The DNA does not just tell you who lived, it tells you who was lost. The absence is a record too. And there is another layer written into this genetic code that is harder to talk about, and more important because of that difficulty. When the researchers compared the X chromosome to the rest of the genome in African Americans, they found a consistent pattern. The X chromosome, which is passed disproportionately through female lines, carried significantly more African ancestry than the genome-wide average. European ancestry, by contrast, was concentrated in the portions of the genome that are not sex-linked. The pattern showed up everywhere, in every region of the United States, in the Caribbean, across Latin America, where it was even more extreme. Translated from the science into the human truth, the message was stark. European ancestry in Black Americans overwhelmingly entered through male lines. European men, African women. The genetic record carried, in its coldest mathematical language, the signature of systematic sexual violence. Enslaved African women contributed to the gene pool at 1.5 to 2 times the rate of enslaved African men in the United States. In parts of Central America, enslaved women were contributing to the gene pool at 17 times the rate of enslaved men. No historian needed to narrate what happened, the double helix narrated it. But here is what I think the data also says, even if it was not the original question. Those women survived. Their lines survived. Every African American alive today carries the proof of that survival in the deepest architecture of their cells. The violence is written there, yes, undeniably. But so is the endurance. So is the refusal to be erased. So is the fact that the code of an Igbo grandmother, or a Wolof mother, or a Mandinka girl is still running, 300 years later, in the bodies of 45 million people. If you are still with me, stay, because the part that hit me hardest came from a place I had almost forgotten about. That cemetery in Maryland. For over 40 years after the highway excavation, the remains from Catoctin Furnace sat in Smithsonian storage. 27 individuals, their bones measured and filed and waiting. A local historical society, led by people who cared about what that iron forge had cost in human lives, kept the memory alive. But the questions never had answers. Who were these people? Where in Africa had their families originated? Did they have descendants? Were those descendants still alive, walking around somewhere, carrying fragments of these 27 unknown people inside them without knowing it? In 2023, a geneticist named Edo Harney led a team that tried something unprecedented. They extracted DNA from those 200-year-old bones using techniques originally designed for specimens tens of thousands of years old. Paleogenomic methods, built for Neanderthals and Bronze Age skeletons, turned for the first time toward the unmarked graves of enslaved Americans. They sequenced what the bones held. Then, they compared those genetic profiles to a database of more than 9 million living people. What came back was a number: 41,799. That is how many living Americans shared genetic material with the people buried at Catoctin Furnace. Nearly 42,000 relatives alive right now, connected by invisible threads of shared ancestry to 27 people whose names no one recorded. Among them, roughly 3,000 were close relatives, within 9 degrees of kinship. Great-great-great-grandchildren, 6th cousins, 7th cousins. People close enough in the genetic web that the connection was not abstract, it was real. And the highest concentration of those close relatives, the single place where the most living kin were found, was Maryland, the same state, nearly the same ground, after the furnace closed, after emancipation, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Jim Crow and the Great Migration that carried 6 million Black Americans out of the South and into the industrial cities of the North and West. After all of that upheaval, after all of that movement, the descendants of the people who worked Catoctin Furnace had, in remarkable numbers, never left. Nobody told them to stay. Nobody could have. The paper trail connecting them to that ground was gone. There was no family Bible with names and dates, no deed, no church record. But something held, something in the fabric of a community, something passed down not in documents but in proximity, in the decision, generation after generation, to stay close. And then the DNA confirmed what the community had been living all along without knowing it. The genetic analysis also revealed where the Catoctin individuals had come from before they were brought to Maryland. Their African ancestry traced to the Wolof and Mandinka peoples of Senegambia and the Congo of Central Africa. Their European ancestry connected to Great Britain and Ireland. For the first time in 200 years, people who had been reduced to anonymous bones in a cemetery no one remembered were given back their origins, not their names. Those are likely gone forever, but their peoples, their geographies. A line drawn across the Atlantic from Maryland to Senegambia to the Congo Basin, connecting the dead to the living, and the living to the lands their ancestors once knew. One of the Smithsonian researchers said something I have not been able to stop thinking about. This knowledge was severed by slavery, she said, and this study demonstrates the power of genomics to reconstruct some of what has been destroyed. Reconstruct, not recover. That distinction matters, and I think it matters more than any single finding in any single study. You cannot recover a name that was never written down. You cannot bring back a language that died on a plantation in 1792. You cannot undo the Middle Passage or unsell a child from their mother at a dock in Charleston. What you can do is build something new from the signal that survived. A new kind of origin story, assembled not from paper, but from adenine and thymine and guanine and cytosine, the 4 letters of a language older than any human alphabet. The dead could not write their names on stone, so they wrote them in chemistry, and they trusted the future to learn the language. The science is still young. It has limits that are important to name honestly. DNA can trace ancestry to broad regions and sometimes to specific ethnic groups, but it cannot yet tell you which village your ancestor walked out of, or what song was being sung the night they were taken. It cannot tell you whether the woman whose mitochondria you carry loved someone, or what she called the river near her home, or whether she fought when they put her on the ship. The reference databases remain uneven. There are vast stretches of Africa where the genetic populations have not been sampled in enough detail, where the map has holes that mirror, in an uncomfortable way, the same old patterns of whose stories get told and whose get left in the dark. And there is a tension in all of this that is worth sitting with. When a person takes a DNA test and sees Yoruba or Igbo or Mende on their results, they are seeing a statistical inference, a probability based on shared genetic markers with reference populations living in those regions today. It is not a membership card. It is not a passport. It does not erase 300 years of distance or undo the cultural rupture of the Middle Passage. The Yoruba people living in Lagos today have their own continuous history, their own relationship to that name, and a stranger in Atlanta receiving a percentage on a screen is not the same thing as belonging to that community. But it is something. It is a direction, a compass heading. Where before there was only a wall and a silence, now there is a line on a map pointing to a place that is real. And for millions of people who grew up being told their story started in America, that line changes everything. Not because it gives them a complete answer, because it gives them a place to begin asking. And there are things the DNA reveals that are painful in ways no chart can contain. When a third of African American men carry a Y chromosome of European origin, that is not a neutral data point. When the genetic signal from an entire people is diminished because they died before they could have children, that silence in the data is a kind of testimony. The science does not come with comfort. It comes with truth. And the truth is complicated and incomplete and still unfolding. But what it has already given is something that did not exist before. For millions of Americans who were told, by history and by silence, that their story began at a wall in 1870 and that everything before it was unknowable, DNA has said, no, it was not unknowable. It was unasked. And now that we are asking, the dead are answering. They are answering from the mitochondria, from the long spiraling chains of nucleotides that passed from mother to daughter for 300 years without anyone understanding what they carried. The Yoruba are answering. The Igbo are answering. The Wolof, the Mandinka, the Congo, the Mende, the Isan, they are all still speaking, not from graves. From grocery stores and classrooms and kitchen tables in Baltimore and Atlanta and Houston and Chicago, their code is walking around, 45 million strong, in the bodies of people who are only now beginning to hear what it says. I think about those 27 people at Catoctin Furnace. We still do not know what they were called. We do not know if they dreamed about the places they came from, or if those places had already faded from memory. We do not know what they whispered to each other at the end of a shift, or whether they looked at the mountains around them and saw beauty, or saw a cage. Those things are gone. But their bodies held a message, folded into the double helix, packed into every cell, written in a language that would not be invented for another 150 years. And the message, after 2 centuries of silence, was simple. We were here. We were Wolof. We were Mandinka. We were Congo. We came from somewhere real. And we left ourselves inside you. 42,000 answers. From 27 people whose names we never knew.